Welcome to the yes side of the use of solitary confinement does constitute cruel and unusual punishment. So this presentation was put together by Katie Baxter, Corbin Hogg, and Amanda Jones. So to start off, what is solitary confinement? So solitary confinement is the placement of individuals in locked, highly restricted, and isolated cells or similar areas of confinement with limited or no human contact and few, if any, rehabilitative services. Placement in solitary confinement frequently lasts for weeks, months, or even years at a time. Solitary confinement causes negative physical and psychological outcomes. Some of these include mental health issues, little to no human contact, and the potential for abuse. So there are many ethical concerns regarding this topic. Some of these include degrading, inhumane treatment. So ethical principles are often violated by harsh living conditions and degrading treatment. There's also a lack of transparency and accountability. So the criteria for placing an individual in solitary confinement is often cloudy, and this gives the opportunity to abuse power. So prison guards are not mental health professionals. Their methods can often do more harm than good, and incarcerated individuals often endure physical and psychological abuse, neglect, and humiliation at the hands of prison guards. So, in an investigation of a prison in Alabama, the Department of Justice found that prison staff used chemicals, batons, and other forms of physical abuse to punish solitary confinement prisoners. The excessive use of force resulted in 2 deaths and other severe injuries, including broken bones and extensive bleeding. Physical torture, such as restraints, can be used with no reports being made. Sensory deprivation, permanent lights, extreme temperatures, and insomnia are consequences of the situation. So, solitary confinement can cause extreme suffering and worsen symptoms. The majority of those held in solitary confinement experience adverse emotional effects that can range from acute to chronic. Confined prisoners report feeling of panic and rage, including irritability, hostility, and poor impulse control. Additionally, they frequently exhibit symptoms of anxiety that vary from low levels of stress to severe panic attacks. Isolated inmates also experience symptoms of depression, such as hopelessness, mood swings, and withdrawal. These depressive symptoms may even escalate to thoughts of self-harm and suicide. So compared to the general prison population, rates of suicide and self-harm are particularly high in prisoners assigned to solitary confinement. So it also impedes rehabilitation, recovery, and community reintegration. Many of the issues that confined prisoners have during isolation are also prevalent post-isolation. Those who are isolated also exhibit maladjustment disorders and problems with aggression both during confinement and afterwards. Furthermore, inmates often have difficulty adjusting to social contact post-isolation and may engage in increased prison misconduct and express hostility towards correctional officers. So it can also cause adverse long-term consequences for cognitive and adaptive functioning. Inmates' cognitive processes tend to deteriorate while they are in isolation. Some confined inmates report memory loss, and a significant portion of isolated inmates reported impaired concentration. Many are unable to read or watch television since these activities are their few sources of entertainment. So solitary confinement can also have severe physical consequences. Inmates in solitary confinement are often deprived of outdoor exercise. This is one of the basic human needs safeguarded by the Eighth Amendment. So the denial of outdoor recreation for inmates who are held in solitary for extended periods is cruel and unusual in and of itself. Solitary confinement further threatens physical health by way of increased levels of stress, anxiety, and depression. These effects are particularly dangerous for older inmates or inmates with chronic heart conditions or diabetes, which are usually managed with regular physical activity and are aggravated by heightened levels of stress and anxiety. Isolated inmates often report symptoms similar to those of hypertension, such as chronic headaches, trembling, sweaty palms, extreme dizziness, and heart palpitations. Inmates also experience trouble with their eating and digestion. A lack of appetite and drastic weight loss is often accompanied with irregular digestion. Inmates in isolation may also have difficulty sleeping, and some may experience insomnia. Consequently, inmates report feelings of chronic lethargy. So let's talk about Albert Woodfox. In 1972, Albert and another were convicted of killing a corrections officer named Brett Miller by stabbing. So Albert was widely considered to be held in solitary confinement for the longest time in modern history. He was held in solitary for 43 years. That is a long time. So during these 43 years, he was only subject to 1 hour of exercise in the yard while still shackled and all alone. So there are still doubts about who really killed Brett Miller due to the dangerous conditions the prison harbored. In 1971, there were 82 stabbings with 3 dead. In 1972, there were 52 stabbings with 8 dead. And in 1973, there were 137 stabbings with 13 people dead. Albert was held in a 6x9 cell for 23 hours, sometimes 24 hours a day. There were times where he was only allowed 3 hours a week outside of his cell. Albert was convicted for the murder of Brett Miller with no forensic evidence leading him to it, and the 2 convictions were overturned. In 2016, he was released and committed himself to helping others who have found themselves in similar situations. And then there's the case of Dennis Hope. So in 1990, Dennis Hope was convicted of aggravated robbery with a deadly weapon. He escaped from prison in 1994 and after found was placed in solitary confinement. He was in a cell no larger than a parking space for 22 to 24 hours a day. And the only human interaction he had was with prison staff, and he suffered from anxiety, depression, hallucination, and thoughts of suicide while being denied treatment. He continued to be held in solitary even after Texas officials deemed he was no longer an escape risk. He was held in solitary for 27 years. In April 2023, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear an appeal from him after he argued that his time in solitary confinement violated the constitutional bar against cruel and unusual punishment. So isn't prison supposed to give inmates rehabilitation? So this is achieved through education, employment, and training in specific areas such as automotive mechanics, welding, and more. Education programs help inmates get stable jobs when they get out of prison. According to the Bureau of Justice, they have found there is a 43% reduction in reincarceration rates when the prisoners participate in a prison education program. According to PBS, data from Connecticut found that 66% of inmates who weren't subject to solitary were rearrested within 3 years, while 92% of inmates who were subject to solitary confinement were rearrested within 3 years. This data shows that inmates who are in solitary are more likely. Solitary confinement is not a rehabilitation practice and exacerbates mental health issues and oftentimes makes things worse. So this is the counter-argument. Solitary confinement provides a way for correctional officers to discipline inmates. Solitary confinement disciplines inmates for fighting amongst themselves. This also provides a way to get inmates off of drugs and keeps the prison population safer from dangerous inmates. So solitary confinement can get gang influence away from first-time inmates. This is achieved by finding gang leaders and putting them into solitary confinement. Although the success rate of solitary confinement is low, there are virtually no other options when dealing with dangerous inmates. So to conclude, solitary confinement can have severe negative consequences on physical and psychological health. Few, if any, rehabilitative services are offered, and often, inmates who were in solitary are more likely to reoffend than those who weren't. Although most of the consequences of solitary confinement are severe, we recognize the need for prisons to use confinement in extreme cases. Okay, and these are the references.